Hi, I'm James Patrick, Big Picture. I'd like to introduce you today to a very interesting man named Michael Cremo. He authored a book that I read in high school called Forbidden Archeology. In it, he reviews the archaeological records in the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he found that there's evidence of anatomical humans traversing the earth at hundreds of millions of years ago. In fact, the oldest artifact covered in the book were these artificially made metal spheres found in a mine in South Africa at a strata dated at 2.8 billion years ago. Enjoy.
Could you tell me a little of your background and your family, or how you got into this?
Well, it's kind of an interesting story. I think it has a lot to do with the fact that my father was an officer in the Air Force. He was an intelligence officer, and that meant a few things for me as I was growing up. One thing that it meant was that I was traveling a lot, going to different places in the United States and abroad. And I got exposed to a lot of different cultures and worldviews. Actually, when I was a teenager, I was living in Germany, and I was going to a military school there, a school run by the military for dependents of American military people. And during my vacations, I would go everywhere I possibly could in Europe because I really wanted to take advantage of the opportunity of being there. Mm-hmm. So on one vacation, I went up to Sweden, and I was staying in a youth hostel in Stockholm, and I met some European young people who had traveled overland to India and back. And they told me about their experiences in India, meeting different mystics and yogis, going to the Himalayan mountains, to Kashmir, seeing the Ganges River. And I thought, well, I'd like to do that someday. So I began studying the Vedic literature of India, and that got me interested in history. There's one group of the Vedic texts, they're called the Puranas, which give the histories, and they told of human populations existing on Earth in the very, very distant past, millions and millions of years ago. Mm-hmm. So it was something different than anything I'd heard from my teachers. So that got me looking into the history of archaeology, because when you look in the current textbooks of archaeology, you don't see any evidence for extreme human antiquity. You only see the evidence that supports the now dominant theory of human evolution, which at that time, when I first started looking into it, archaeologists thought went back only about 100,000 years. Mm-hmm. Now they've got it back to about 300,000 years. So I began to wonder, is what these ancient texts are saying, is it mythology, just something that the authors of these texts invented several centuries ago or whenever they put the texts together? Or was there perhaps some factual basis for it? Mm-hmm. So when I looked in the current textbooks of archaeology, I didn't see any such evidence. I only saw the evidence that supports the now dominant theory. But perhaps because of my exposure to people involved in intelligence, I understood that there are certain things going on in the world that most people aren't aware of, that aren't talked about in the media very openly. So I thought, well, maybe there's something more here than meets the eye. So I started looking into the original scientific literature, not what's in the textbooks, but the original scientific reports that the textbooks are based on.
And before you get into that, I just want to. So when you say the things that people don't talk about in the mainstream? Like, I mean, would your father come home and say, like, tell you some of the things of his work, or just generally, you heard about stories in the house that never hit the papers, or just if you could say a little comment on that, kind of, I think it's interests people.
It was not only that my father was involved in these things, but my friends, many of them had parents involved in the intelligence services, CIA, military intelligence, diplomatic intelligence gathering operations. And, sometimes my father would be called off away from home, for some reason. And then later it would come out in the newspapers that, something had happened with the Russians or the East Germans or something. They had shot down a plane. And, and sometimes, and this is not something that people should do, but sometimes my father would bring documents or photographs from work, and I would see them.
And so you'd see there was an undercurrent of active history he was involved with.
And plus, as I said, from things I heard from friends. Like I had one friend who was in his father was connected with the United States Embassy in Germany in Bonn. So sometimes I would spend the weekends with this friend up in Bonn. I was living in Wiesbaden. And he said his father was always talking with General Gehlen on the phone, who was the head of the West German intelligence department.
Yeah, Reinhard Gehlen.
Reinhard Gehlen.
Yeah.
And he said his father had been there since the end of the Second World War. So he was connected with the CIA. So I would hear things on that level. So I just understood there are certain things that are kept secret, confidential. Most people don't know about it. But there is such a thing as hidden knowledge. So I decided to look into this in archaeology. And when I did start looking into the history of archaeology, I began to find many reports, very credible to me anyways, reports of scientists, archaeologists, geologists, paleontologists, other scientists digging into the earth who had reported finding human bones, human artifacts, and human footprints that go much further back in time than the current theories allow. So these things aren't mentioned in the textbooks, and that led me to question, well, why? And it seemed to me from studying the reports that the main reason they were cast into oblivion or kept out of the current discourse is that they contradicted the dominant theories that were emerging about human origins. When I say these things are absent from the textbooks, I'm talking about evidence that may have been discovered during, say, the early history of archaeology, during the 19th century or early 20th century.
So just to give people a little background, I guess the late 1800s, there was a huge, 1850 to 1910, right? It was a huge activity of archaeology. It was a fashionable thing for elites to go and dig things up, right?
Yes. And also at that time, they didn't have a fixed timeline for human origins. The story really begins around 1859 when Charles Darwin published his Origin of Species. And at that time, scientists began to think, well, human beings evolved from some more primitive ape-like creature. They didn't know exactly when, but they went out and started looking for evidence. Mm-hmm. And they were finding evidence, but it wasn't evidence for a missing link, for a being intermediate between modern humans and ancient apes. Mm-hmm. Instead, they were finding evidence for a human presence going back very far in time, much further than would be thought possible today. But because the timeline of human evolution hadn't been fixed, mm-hmm. that was okay. In 1890s, the early 1890s, that changed when a Dutch researcher named Eugene Dubois went to Indonesia, to the island of Java, which was a Dutch colony at the time. And at a site called Trinil in Java, he discovered 2 bones, a very ape-like skull cap mm-hmm. with heavy brow ridges over the eye sockets, uh-huh. and a femur or thigh bone, which looked sort of human. And he found them about 50 feet apart in an excavation he was doing. But he put them together and said, okay, here's the ape-like skull, the human-like femur. This is the missing link we've been looking for. And it turned out to be about a million years old, maybe between 800,000 and 1 million years old. So this became accepted in the world of science. Mm-hmm. And now they had a fixed timeline. Anything human had to be after that. So then it became a problem, well, what to do with all the evidence that had accumulated in previous decades, in the 1860s, 70s,
And was this
80s.
And was this evidence prior to Java Man discovery? Was this widely discussed in the journals and in the field of archaeology? Or?
Yes, it was. So what happened is, and I'll give an example, uh-huh. the California gold mine discoveries. In the mid-19th century, in the 1850s, gold was discovered in California, in the central part of California, in the Sierra Nevada mountains, in several counties, but in Tuolumne County, near the town of Sonora, there's a place called Table Mountain. Mm-hmm. And miners were digging tunnels into the sides of this mountain or plateau. Mm-hmm. And inside the tunnels, they were finding human bones, human artifacts, such as obsidian spear points, stone mortars and pestles. And according to modern geologists, the layers of rock in which these were found date back to the early Eocene period, which means they would be about 50 million years old. So these discoveries came to the attention of the state geologist of California, Dr. J.D. Whitney, a Harvard University educated geologist. Mm-hmm. And he began collecting the artifacts and bones and conducting his own research. and verifying the original discoveries.
Is he from the Whitney family? The
Yes.
big banking family?
Which family?
The Whitneys in New York?
I'm not exactly sure of that. I don't know his whole history.
But he documented these things?
It's possible. Hosea D. Whitney. He could be. Sounds like he could be, having gone to Harvard.
And what year was he?
He was active during the 1870s, 1880s. He published Dr. Whitney published a massive report about these discoveries in his book, The Auriferous Gravels of California. And I think that may not be the exact title, The Auriferous Gravels of the Sierra Nevada in California. I think that's it.
It's in your book, yeah.
Okay. So, in addition to verifying the discoveries that were made by others, Whitney also conducted his own research, and he published a massive study of these California gold mine discoveries in 1880. The book was published by Harvard University's Museum of Comparative Zoology.
Mm-hmm.
And he also made presentations before the American Academy of Sciences about these things.
Mm-hmm.
But scientists later, in the next decade after the Java Man discoveries.
So Whitney's paper in 1880?
Yeah, 1880. And some years later, a very prominent scientist, William H. Holmes, who worked at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C., said in print, if Dr. Whitney had understood the theory of human evolution as we understand it today, he wouldn't have come to those conclusions, despite the imposing array of testimony with which he was confronted. In other words, he said, he should have known, Whitney should have known that couldn't possibly be true. Because, and Holmes directly said this, if his discoveries, Holmes said directly that the main reason Whitney's discoveries shouldn't be accepted is because of the Java Man discoveries that had been made by Dubois in Java. Mm-hmm. So anything human had to be after that, much more recent than Whitney's finds. So after that, Whitney's discoveries were no longer mentioned in the scientific publications.
So, but it just strikes me as both things could be the case, right? I mean, evolution could occur on some level among some species. Humans could be older. Java Man could be some monkey or just two bones unrelated. I mean, like, why does evolution need to necessitate some dating on some? I guess I'm not following Hall's logic.
Well, it's very interesting. What you're saying is possible, and those alternatives were considered. But the consensus among the leading scientists of the day was that Java Man was the benchmark for looking at archaeology. That was the missing link. Mm-hmm. And anything human had to be after that. And before that, they had to be something more primitive and ape-like. And you're right that that in itself doesn't rule out evolution. Could have, the timeline for evolution could have been placed differently. But the kind of evidence that I'm talking about, if you have evidence that humans like us were existing 50 million years ago, that means that your whole picture of evolution has to be radically shifted backward in time. And it's interesting, when I published my book, Forbidden Archeology, I sent a copy of it to any scientist who was still living that I mentioned in the book. One of them was William H. Howell of Harvard University. He was considered one of the architects of the current understanding of human evolution. And after receiving the book, he wrote to me and said, well, this is very interesting. You've done a really good job of going through the literature on this topic and reviewing it. But he wrote, if this kind of evidence that you're presenting in your book is to be taken seriously, it would mean a revision not only of our understanding of human origins, but the whole origin of species. So yes, it's possible that one could explain this evidence by radically altering the timeline for evolution, not just of human beings, because the human beings have to come from something. The evidence that I've documented in Forbidden Archeology, according to William Howells, would have placed humans before the apes and monkeys evolved. So it would involve a pretty radical shift.
Well, maybe let's just establish some basic terms here, because I think a lot of times people say, oh, well, if you question the timeline of evolution, then you're a creationist. They throw you into the Bible creationist camp, and then there's another camp of intelligent design, which some of those people are biblically motivated, some are not. And like, maybe could we describe what these views are, and then there's some others too, right? There's other theories around at the time of Darwin said that there could be some other sort of natural or supernatural origin of life itself, and then you have the second question, not of life but of all these different species, and then how humans got here, right? So people often mix these things, or I bring up your book also to people, when we're discussing this kind of Graham Hancock type last 20,000 years of civilization, and that's a completely different issue than going back millions. Where did humans come from?
Yeah, I deal with deep time, and the archaeological evidence, if we look at all of it and not just what's in today's textbooks, puts a human presence going back tens of millions, even hundreds of millions of years. So that means, if it's taken seriously, that we need new explanations for human origins. But in Forbidden Archeology, I didn't give an alternative explanation. I presented all of the cases that I uncovered in my research into the primary scientific literature, and I gave both sides or all sides of the evidence. In other words, people who were the critics, people who were supporting it, and I let the readers make up their own minds about it. But to me, the evidence really suggests that we need a new understanding of human origins. But I put off my version of what that new origin should be to another book, because I wanted people to be free to make up their own minds about it. So,
Well, I really appreciate you did that, because I think it makes the book stronger.
yeah, well, of course, it wasn't my original intention. My co-author and I originally intended to put both the archaeological evidence that contradicts the current theories and our new proposed understanding based on our Vedic commitments and influences. But it turned out that the research into the archaeological evidence yielded more than we thought we were going to find in the beginning. Wow. In the beginning, I thought, well, maybe we'll find a few interesting cases and we'll write a short little tract about it and kind of go on to other things. But as I got into the research, one case just led to another. You know, for example, in Dr. Whitney's book, there was a little footnote about a Portuguese archaeologist who had made similar discoveries in Europe. So then I tracked down those reports and visited the museum in Lisbon where his artifacts were being kept, not displayed, but kept in the storage facilities. And then I relocated some of the sites where he made his discoveries. And then in his report, Carlos Ribeiro's report from Portugal, there was a little footnote about a French geologist who had made some discoveries in France. So it went to and one report just led to another until we had enough to fill up a 900-page book. So there really wasn't space to present our Vedic alternative. I saved that for another book. So that did allow readers, and I'm happy that it turned out this way, to come up with their own proposals. And you know, some of them, as you say, might involve creationism, some might involve intelligent design, some might involve extraterrestrial influences, some propose time travelers as the explanation for artifacts found in places that were supposedly too old for them. So yes, there were reactions like that.
And so, just real quick, what is intelligent design theory?
Well, when we're thinking about the origin of life,
this is all life at all life in general.
Yes, because ultimately, I think one does have to trace things to some original cause. Ultimately, that's where it leads. And there have been different theories proposed for how life arose and how the complex forms of living organisms came into being. One of them that is very dominant today is the physicalist, materialist view that there's nothing more involved than material elements in the form of molecules combining together according to physical and chemical laws in such a way that you get some first single-celled organism that can reproduce itself. And then somehow or other, the individual single-celled organisms begin to clump together to form multicellular organisms. And this happens in water, in the sea, really. And some of them become plants, some become animals. And they gradually develop and then move on to the land.
This is just the basics of evolutionary theory?
Yeah.
Yeah,
And
okay.
it's all happening by natural selection.
Okay. But I was always very intellectually unsatisfied with the natural selection idea just because it's a reductionistic concept where you're saying, you know, okay, you have all these traits already, and then the useless ones get weeded out through selection, right? But how do new traits of animals or plants come into existence? It doesn't have any explaining power for that.
Yes.
So that's what always like bothered. It's always seemed like some glaring issue with survival of the fittest explaining the development of new things. It's like a chaos will reduce qualities, it doesn't have a creating power, you know? There has to be some other force or natural, supernatural, whatever, that factors into the creation of new, or the development of new things.
Yes, well, you're pointing out a key difficulty in those evolutionary scenarios that involve only natural selection. Now, there have been different responses to that, one of them being creation. In other words, the idea that there is some higher intelligence, usually attributed to God, that manifests that complexity that we observe in organisms and how they're adapted to their environments. But this usually involves some creation ex nihilo, out of nothing. And that is one proposal for the origin of species. And Darwin actually said that he once accepted that idea of special creation. And then there is the intelligent design aspect of things, where they don't directly speak of God, but they have a way of saying that if you carefully study the structure of an organism, even a single cell, it has a level of complexity that precludes the idea that that complexity could have arisen by gradual steps. Because if you look at any complex machinery, it has different parts, and they all have to be there for the mechanism to perform its function, its biological function. Like if you have a mouse trap, it's a simple bit of machinery, but everything has to be there. The spring, the little thing that the mouse would have to hit.
It just doesn't explain if you say chaos will create order. Like, there has to be order creates order. There has to be some orderly principle for orderly things to come out of it. It's sort of like saying you're going to throw 1,000, I don't know. You're just going to throw a bunch of sticks and the house is going to fly together.
Or a 747, if they still had any. That's an example that was given by some scientists. So
It just surprises me. Well, and then it also gets, and I'd like to get back to the archaeology stuff, but I guess this idea of evolution, survival of the fittest, has somehow been tied up with the fall of religion and people drifting away from faith, and so then they glom on to evolutionism as a sort of surrogate for God. And then, I mean, I think Marx even wrote, the survival of the fittest, this Darwin's theory are very good for our political agenda. And so it's very tied up with these political religious movements as well, right?
Well, there's some deeper aspects to it that have to do with consciousness and also with our conception of time.
In your 1993 book, Forbidden Archeology, you discuss evidence of extreme human antiquity, many cases going back tens of millions of years, some hundreds of millions of years. And then you're saying in the appendix, there's some extreme anomalous artifacts. So what do you, I guess, where did the bulk of the cases lie?
The bulk of the cases were stone tools and weapons, and some cases of human skeletal remains, and in some cases human footprints found in layers of rock that are older than would be allowed by current theories. So most of this evidence that's in the main body of the book can be sourced in scientific literature, peer-reviewed scientific publications of the past 150 or so years. Some of the extreme anomalies didn't make their way into the scientific literature. These are discoveries by ordinary people that may be mentioned in newspaper articles or something of that sort. And that's kind of to be expected, I think. You know, if there is archaeological evidence for extreme human antiquity in the layers of the earth, then we should expect that it be found not only by professional scientists, but and published in the professional scientific literature, but there must also be discoveries made by ordinary people, miners, for example, and others whose professions involve digging into the earth. So things like that happen.
So what portion of these are coming from mines? A lot of these finds are coming from mines?
The extreme anomalies, yes, but also some of the scientifically reported evidence, like the California gold mine discoveries that we were discussing. Those came from mines. But this is also true of many of the accepted evidence that is found in the mainstream textbooks of archaeology. It may originally have been noticed by miners, and then the professional scientists become involved. In some cases, it's found in the course of excavations by archaeologists, but in some cases they misinterpret the evidence so that it fits within the dominant paradigm.
Okay, so one of the most extreme cases, or the oldest case in your book, is the case of these hematite balls, spheres found in a mine in South Africa. Is that right?
Yes. Those came to my attention originally through what is called a tabloid newspaper that deals with all kinds of extreme phenomena. But I didn't include it in the book, Forbidden Archaeology, simply because of the tabloid newspaper report. I got in touch with the director of the Museum of Natural History in Klerksdorp, South Africa, where the objects were said to be stored. And he wrote back to me, yes, these objects do exist. There's not very much published about them in the scientific literature, but they are there. So on that basis, I decided I could include them in the book.
You decided you couldn't on that basis?
I could.
You could?
On
the correspondence?
Yeah, as a result of correspondence with the museum director.
So you read in a tabloid that they existed, that they were found in this mine, and that they were in the museum?
Yes.
And then you got in touch with the museum?
Yes.
And then how old do those date? Or how old is the rock strata from which they came?
Well, from the museum director, I got a reference to some correspondence from a scientist in South Africa who identified the mine that they came from and the age of the formation, which turned out to be about 2.8 billion years. So that's really quite extreme. And, you know, the response to that was by mainstream science was, these things are natural formations, they don't involve any type of human activity, they appear to be manufactured in some way, in the sense that these round spherical objects have, running around their equators, grooves, sometimes 2, sometimes 3, 4 parallel grooves running around their equators. They look like they aren't simply a natural formation. And later, after the book was published, I got some responses from scientists that, no, these things are perfectly natural. One geologist wrote on an internet discussion group, you can find these things everywhere. I've seen them myself. And I said, well, can you provide me with an example from anywhere else in the world of such an object? And he said, well, no, because they're really so common that nobody's ever bothered to take a photograph of them. You know, that's, so my position has been that I would really welcome any evidence that anyone could provide of how those grooves could have formed naturally on this object and the others like it. So thus far, nobody's been able to do that. So I think that leaves open the possibility that somehow or other, 2.8 billion years ago, there was some type of intelligent being that produced these things.
And so you got one of them here. Can we take a look?
Well, this is not one of the best samples, but there are, let's see. So this is like one of the objects, and you see these parallel grooves, 2 of them there, that go around into the, underneath these. I mean, this would have to be carefully cleaned with dental equipment or something to remove these deposits that cover it, but on this part of the sphere, you see the two grooves that go around back into these deposits.
Can you kind of rotate it a little? So this is hematite. It's a sort of iron-like material.
Yeah, it's a type of iron ore. That's why it's a little bit oxidized and a reddish brown color.
So is it? Can you kind of rotate it a little? So it's a spherical.
Yeah, spherical object.
But then the other one that you got, so you got three of them as part of the making of the Mysterious Origins of Man?
Yes, and the best ones were shown on the documentary that aired on NBC in, I think it was 1996.
In Klerksdorp, South Africa, hundreds of metallic spheres were found by miners in Precambrian strata, said to be a fantastic 2.8 billion years old. The controversy centers around the fine grooves encircling some of the spheres. Lab technicians were at a loss to explain how they could have been formed by any known natural process. According to the curator of the Klerksdorp Museum, Rolf Mars, these spheres are a complete mystery. They look man-made, yet at the time in Earth's history when they came to rest on this rock, no intelligent life existed. They're like nothing I've ever seen before.
Okay. Maybe can you rotate it a little more? Like all the way around then. So those, now you said it underwent some analysis before NBC would air the show?
Yes, they had to be submitted to an independent company of metallurgists for examination. And they didn't have any explanation for how the grooves could have formed, but they did identify the material as hematite.
And now that can be melted down? That material? That material can be melted down into like a moldable form?
I don't know about that.
So you think they were carved at some point?
Well, yes, nobody has been able to give me a convincing natural explanation of how these objects could have formed with the parallel grooves that go around them. So that is, to me, that's the main thing.
It's this grooves here?
Yeah, to me, the main thing about these objects is that nobody has been able to give me a convincing natural explanation how these parallel grooves could have formed by simply natural processes.
So maybe one or two, but if you're finding hundreds like that.
Yeah.
Okay. So what, I guess to wrap up, what was the conclusion of your book then?
I got the idea that there may be, I got the idea of extreme human antiquity from my studies in the Vedic text, especially the Puranas. And for me, as a practitioner of a Vedic system of knowledge, a statement from the Puranas is evidence. But if I go out to the world, especially to the world of science, they're not going to accept a statement from the Puranas as evidence. So what I can do, however, is say, if what the Puranas say is true, then we should expect to find archaeological reports of discoveries of evidence in the form of human bones, human artifacts, and human footprints that are consistent with what the Puranas say. So to test that hypothesis, I looked at the entire history of archaeology, not just what you find in today's textbooks, but I searched through the entire primary scientific literature on archaeology. And when I did that, I found numerous reports of discoveries of human bones, human artifacts, human footprints that are consistent with the timeline of the Puranas for a human presence on this planet. So my conclusion is that there is evidence for the existence of human beings existing on this planet for far longer times than the current dominant paradigm in human origins allows.
So, in the Vedic Puranas, how far back do they? How far in the Vedic Puranas? How far back do they put human or humanoid life on planet Earth?
Okay, it's a very good question, but to understand it, we have to first consider the Vedic cyclical concept of time. The basic unit of Vedic cyclical time is called the kalpa, or the day of Brahma, and it lasts for 4,320,000,000 years. It's followed by a night of Brahma, which also lasts for 4.32 billion years, which is followed by another day, another night, another day, another night. Now, during the days of Brahma, life, including human life, is manifest in the universe. During the nights of Brahma, it's dormant. Life is dormant. It's like you go to sleep at night, you're not active. So, according to the Vedic cosmological calendar, we're now in the middle of the current kalpa, or day of Brahma. That means the day of Brahma started about 2.2 billion years ago. And in the Puranas, for example, the Bhagavad Purana, it is stated that human beings and other forms of life were manifested not just on Earth, but within the universe as a whole at that time, about 2.2 billion years ago. So that's what I would expect to find as the timeline for human origins, according to the Puranas.
So you'd expect to find life. This is referring to Earth, or this is referring to all the universe?
Well, all of the universe, because according to the Vedic cosmology, the entire universe is inhabited. But we have to consider it's a consciousness-based universe. I will point out that modern science is moving in that direction. There's a whole field of study financed by NASA called exobiology. With the Webb telescope and other assets that they have, astrophysicists and astronomers have identified planets capable of supporting Earth on other solar systems outside our own, in other parts of our galaxy, many of them. So there's an active search for signs of life on these other exoplanets. And there are many of them, so many of them that many current day scientists have concluded on some of them they must have advanced civilizations, perhaps capable of communicating with our solar system, our planet within our solar system. Actually, archaeologists are becoming very interested in extraterrestrial archaeology. I've attended several meetings of the World Archaeological Congress in which there have been whole sessions about extraterrestrial archaeology. One thing they're considering is what will happen when we go to the moon, to the Mars, and other places. Who is going to own the artifacts that are found there? Of course, one thing they're talking about is things that we've sent up to the moon and to Mars and other places. And the United Nations and other organizations are passing laws and treaties about these things. But another thing that even professional archaeologists are considering is, what will we do if we find things that we didn't send up there to the moon or elsewhere?
Well, I do believe there was a Brookings, 1958 Brookings Institute report around the creation of NASA, before the creation of NASA, and they discussed this matter, what do we do in this case, and they said we should just keep it secret, I think, in the report. So there's some speculation that NASA may have already done this, they've found things, they've kept it secret, or,
well,
you know,
maybe this is part of the gradual reveal that they're allowing scientists to talk about these things in their professional gatherings.
Yeah, I mean, some speculate they faked a lot of this stuff, but I mean, I'm not sure, but I do know the Brookings report around it did discuss this archaeological issue and say that they should keep these artifacts secret. But if there is in fact artifacts on the moon, I mean, they would be very old. You're talking millions of years, or I mean,
yeah, if we didn't send them.